Welcome to 5 Books for Catholics, where an expert selects and explains 5 outstanding books on some aspect of Catholic life, doctrine, or culture. Fatherhood is one of the most fundamental human and social roles. However, many point to a crisis of fatherhood across the West. Said crisis does not consist merely in many fathers neglecting their vocation and responsibilities. More concerningly, there is a widespread confusion about what it means to be a male and a father. To overcome this crisis, we need to turn to Christ and His Church for grace and guidance. As John Paul II teaches in Familiaris Consortio, in revealing and in reliving on earth the very fatherhood of God, a man is called upon to ensure the harmonious and united development of all the members of the family. He will perform this task by exercising generous responsibility for the life conceived under the heart of the mother, by a more solicitous commitment to education, a task he shares with his wife, by work, which is never a cause of division in the family, but promotes its unity and stability, and by means of the witness he gives of an adult Christian life, which effectively introduces the children into the living experience of Christ and the Church. In this interview, Deacon David Delaney discusses the Christian conception of fatherhood and recommends 5 books in it. Deacon David Delaney is the founder of the Mother of the Americas Institute and is current director and a senior fellow. He is also chairman and president of the board of directors. Deacon Delaney previously served as founding academic dean for 2 separate institutions of higher education dedicated to theological formation. He has a doctorate in systematic theology from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. His research interests in areas of the Trinity, Christology, ecclesiology, liturgy and the sacraments, mission and the new evangelization, all considered from the perspective of an adequate anthropology. He is the author of Viri Dignitate, Personhood, Masculinity and Fatherhood in the Thought of John Paul II, published by Emmaus Academic, and The Great Mystery, Formation for Flourishing Marriages. Deacon David Delaney, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Father. It's good to be here.
Fatherhood is both a biological and a moral category. The latter is rooted in the former and consists in being a good father, discharging well the responsibilities incumbent upon a father. Presumably, the books you've selected deal primarily with fatherhood in the moral or spiritual sense. How would you define fatherhood?
Yes, fatherhood is ultimately, I think we have to generally go back to the Trinity for beginning to understand anything about the human condition, what it means to be created. Fatherhood is understood in terms of, I suppose, God's fatherhood. That's really where many of the many of the spiritual masters that discuss this that will point us. And fatherhood ultimately has many different manifestations in terms of our experience as human beings, but it really has to. It's rooted ultimately, I think, in the order of love. Fatherhood is ultimately begins with a love of initiation, a love that first offers itself and then ought to patiently await the response. What that means, ultimately, it begins with what we might understand as masculinity. And masculinity is one of 2 ways of being a human person. A complement, we can only be a human person. St. John Paul II points this out as either male or female. A human person is made, in a certain sense, to pour itself out. I think one of my books on the Great Mystery uses 2 pictures from Raphael. His painting of the crucifixion is kind of photoshopped together with the wedding of Mary and Joseph, and I like that those, especially Raphael's painting. This is the one in which you have the angels catching the precious blood, and I think the little angel catching as St. John points out, right, is coming out of it, out of his side, out of Jesus' side, is the water and the blood. This pouring out, I think, is a good manifestation and a good analogy for human personhood. Is meant to be poured out. Our fulfillment as human persons come from being poured out. The way that a father does that is he pours himself out to others, and ultimately fatherhood is the fulfillment, I would say, of what it means to be a masculine human person. So fatherhood is pouring himself out to give to the other what the other might not have, in other words, to bring about the good that one has that is not yet actualized in the other person, and to foster that, to bring it to fulfillment. So it's simply the way, at its very root, it's the structure of love that is ordered to bring about the good of the other.
Fatherhood is, as you've already mentioned, is an analogical concept, and the source and exemplar of all fatherhood is the first person of the Trinity. Is consolidating one's relation with God the Father through the liturgy, sacraments, and prayer the first thing that men need to do to cultivate fatherhood?
I think that we can't, whether we do it, certainly there's possibility in the natural order to cultivate fatherhood without reference to the supernatural order, but in the fallen world, one can't do that adequately or effectively. And so in terms of the first things first, right, in terms of the priority rather than necessarily the first, chronologically, I would certainly say that's the case. We really the more we want to be, as men, fathers, whether it's in the natural order or supernatural order, a natural father bringing birth to children, or a spiritual fatherhood, which is simply bringing to birth, if you will, nurturing within another person that which they have not yet actualized. This can only adequately be done, fully be done, with reference to the insertion of the father, the husband, the man, into the Trinitarian order, and fructifying that through the liturgy. So, yes, I would say yes with those distinctions.
Another model of fatherhood that the Church proposes is St. Joseph. Just as the Holy Family is the model for all Christian families, St. Joseph is the model for all fathers in one regard. Is this a theme you also have addressed in your work?
I have. In fact, he is. I think Saint John Paul II makes this point himself as well. He wrote a work called a play called "The Radiation of Fatherhood," a beautiful meditation on the difficulties of fatherhood and the fallen order. But he talks about Saint Joseph. Saint John Paul II talks about Saint Joseph as the perfect manifestation of the radiation of God's fatherhood, the fatherhood of God. And this is what we have to, as men, regardless of what our state is in life, that is our calling, to radiate the fatherhood of God to those that we encounter, which again means, especially in terms of the fallen order, of great attentiveness to and self-awareness to the spiritual life, that we have to die continually, as we began with baptism, to ourselves, though, crushing within ourselves the impetus to turn in on ourselves, to turn out, and to be able to be other person oriented, having reference not primarily to one's own benefit, but reference to the good of the other, which frees us from ourselves. That ultimately is what allows us to become the fathers that we are called to become. And St. John Paul II, he has his Redemptoris Custos, the guardian of the Redeemer. This meditation on Saint Joseph, I think, is a beautiful meditation on how Saint Joseph does that perfectly. And so that's a kind of a central theme within my book, Viri Dignitatem.
Is there, as some claim, a crisis of fatherhood in the West?
There is indeed. This has not been gone unnoticed, but we haven't really been able to do much about it. It seems, primarily because we are still living. We haven't recognized adequately, individually and collectively, the need to be in the world without being of the world. The crisis of fatherhood, ultimately, it's always existed in individuals, but the way that this is spread to us corporately, and the predominant number of men who don't adequately understand what it means to be a male, and this is in part and parcel of the whole problem, because women are being confused about what it means to be a female. But this is a great opportunity too, to get greater understanding, greater depth of articulation of really personhood and sex difference, masculinity and femininity. And I think that this has to be a root part of the solution. There's certainly practical things that we can do, but men have to learn to not be afraid. We have to learn to fearlessly continue to offer ourselves. The difficulty of radiating God's fatherhood is that we have to pour ourselves out, and in this fallen world, pouring oneself out can mean the experience of what might be lost. But the cross has shown us that it's not loss; it's nothing but gain. We have to be willing to offer ourselves. Men, because of the fact what the society is kind of formed into the kind of this androgynous attempt to I suppose level all differentiation, has quashed within men authentic masculinity. Clearly, there's excess. There's have been excesses of a fallen imposition of masculine gifts that has brought about damage to women and to men and to society. But but that doesn't mean that we can disown what our obligation is. The Jesus Christ is the perfect representation of that, right? He is the bridegroom who continually offers himself to the bride. His bride ends up putting him to death, and he continues to pour himself out for her. This fearlessness, this willingness to offer oneself to to one's wife, to one's children, regardless of whether they initially accept and respond to that or not, and continually doing that. This is what ultimately fatherhood means. We can't shrink from it, becoming the phrase escapes me, but shrinking violets or something like that. But we have to. But neither can we respond in this machismo, my way or the highway. That in fact is part of the caricature of masculinity that has enabled this narrative that demands like a leveling of differences to be something that seems not necessarily plausible if you think about it in reality, but at least desirable from some perspective. So the crisis is here; it is getting worse, but it's a great opportunity, I think, for greater clarification and a greater embrace of the authenticity of what fatherhood really is.
And could you elaborate a little more on the causes of this crisis of fatherhood in the West?
Yes. Well, ultimately, it's Adam and Eve. But I think if we bring ourselves up a little bit to the modern time, the contemporary time, I think that ultimately it begins just like Adam and Eve began with the attack on a woman, and the man failing to protect her. I think the attack also, began with women in the dissatisfaction. It began with narratives that were partly true and partly weren't true. We begin to see this, I think, in the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, and this desire of women to have more of a part and more of a play in public life, and the inadequate response to that. As we start to see the way that manifests itself, especially I would say that diminution of sex difference becomes the main point, because of the way that men responded to this desire of women, for more of a role in public life, was to really lean into the caricature of masculine oppression, which exists, but certainly most people recognize that in lives, mothers have always been, in a certain sense, wives have had, in a certain sense, a dominant role within family life, not universally, but understanding how masculinity and femininity really, in this desire for moving out into a life that provided more leisure, more opportunity for men and women to be more engaged outside of the home, was something that I think was the beginning of this. At the same time, there were attacks against what prevented women from doing so, and this was the fact that women of in the age of having children were limited and prevented from that. And so I would say, a seminal event that allowed this change in mindset to occur was the Lambeth Conference in the 1930s, which allowed within Christianity, which was certainly dying, but as a society, but allowed the disconnection of procreation, the idea of the meaning of procreation from married life and from the meaning of sex, to be now, what does it really mean? It basically becomes open to definition. It becomes more and more self-referentiality in terms of the will to power, if I would say. This really becomes the mindset, and anything that gets in the way of that began to turn our relationships one against the other. So the idea that what really leads to this begins, in many ways, it's a social phenomenon, but the ivory towers of academia, in many ways provided in some ways, it ends up being lived out. These things started to bear fruit, that started to, in a certain sense, have it both ways. The goodness of the body in terms of what you can get out of it, without having an integral view of really what it means to be human. That these things, while we can look at them in pieces and parts, aren't parts to be taken out and done with as we please. I think that the 1920s, by the way, in the United States anyway, provided the foundation for this. By the 1960s, what had kind of died out because of the Second World, the Depression, the Second World War, came back with with a vengeance. And there we have the sexual revolution, and it is now socially, in many ways, and also in a certain sense, in at least the dominant organs of academia and public life, the connection between masculinity, femininity in family life and marriage it's become completely fragmented, and we have not recovered that. And so we became completely lost about what it means to be a person, a human person, and what it means to be a male and a female. And so the crisis of fatherhood is nothing other than a symptom of a much more fundamental problem. St. John Paul II called the 20th century the crisis of the human person, and it was, and we're continuing to experience that crisis of human personhood, that I would argue, at its very root, as what it means to be a male and what it means to be a female.
Reading the right books can be helpful, even necessary. However, is that enough to help men learn about fatherhood?
It's a start. You have to know the truth in order to identify the good to be pursued. And so if you don't know the good, then whatever action you take is going to be reaching out, grasping in the dark. So reading books is the essential point. But it's not sufficient. It's never going to be sufficient. We have to be able to transform ourselves in Christ. We have to be able to learn to say no to ourselves practically, to put into practice those things that we learn to be the truth, and how that is ordered to the good that we must be that we must pursue. So I would say that this is one of the things. Pope Benedict, I love that man. He points this out in terms of what the church is doing in this in the Jubilee to Catechists in the year 2000. He presents the fact that he says we've done a very good job in forming the intellect relative to where we were in the in the 60s and 70s, but we have not paid enough sufficient parallel attention to the forming of the will. And I would say that that was true in the year 2000, and it's true today, some 24 years later, that we still have not. I will say I've taught in seminary for 20 some years, and most of the formation that we call human formation and spiritual formation tends to be mostly intellectual formation about those topics. We have not quite gotten the point of what practical formation needs to be and how that needs to take place. I have a marriage formation program that I call the Great Mystery, which tries to build this integral approach to formation. I'm working. I belong to the personal ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter, and I'm working with I'm working as the director of the diaconate formation, and we're working right now with the Josephinum and trying to move forward with a more integral approach, a practical approach as well to human spiritual formation. Pastoral formation, I think, many ways has been much more practical because it's much more obvious, but human and spiritual really haven't. I think men have to recognize that we have to be our own formators. If we're going to be good men, we're going to be good natural and spiritual fathers, good husbands. We have to learn that we can't just learn about it, we have to change it. But it has to begin with learning about it.
Well, it's the classical theme of the formation of the moral virtues.
Yes, exactly. Virtues, we've completely lost the idea because, well, at least in the West, in the United States, we have a consumer-oriented, a consumer-based economy. Which usually it's kind of like this is probably not technically true, but it's kind of like a Ponzi scheme. If it's not growing, it's collapsing. You have to get people to consume things that perhaps they don't need, and working concupiscence against the human condition sells. And so we are a society that build vice. And so virtue is, if it's heard of, it's either and seen and appreciated, it's seen as a distance, as an unreachable idea. But for the most part, it's either unheard of or lampooned as something that's completely contrary, to human good. And so practically working on building virtue, which will begin with overcoming vice, is a necessity. And by the way, I have a 10-point program as part of my formation program. That very first point in the program is doing vices in inventory, starting to work overcoming vice and building virtue. We cannot begin to be authentic men and fathers without that.
Could you explain the work you do at the Mother of America's Institute?
Sure. The Mother of the Americas Institute is it's an apostolate that was formed basically around this issue of formation. We've been doing it. There are just so many different apostolates now that are doing a lot of good work, and they are rightly taking from society much of of the world, much of the things that have helped the society to become much more efficient, much more productive, using organs to reach people. These are all good things, but one of the things that we haven't quite stepped back and looked at in terms of the way that we are doing evangelization, that we're doing catechesis, that we're doing ministry, is that the mindset that have built really these organs of communication and organization have based themselves on an industrial model. And that industrial model has a corrupt view of human nature and the human person. Proverbially, we see it actually in business. We use the term human resources. We think of this as just raw material to proverbially grind up and extrude into the different shapes that we want. And we do that when we look at things primarily in terms of outcomes. If outcomes become the end, then the human person becomes a means. We have to completely re-look and see how we can improve the fruitfulness of what we're doing by beginning with an adequate anthropology and re-looking at what we're doing and the way we are doing things, which primarily are all about formation, or ought to be about the formation of the human person. And so Mother of the Americas Institute is starting from the very foundation of what it means to be a person. We're made for relationships, and we have to be able to live those relationships fruitfully. And so we're re-looking at things from an adequate anthropology, of looking at the potencies that God has put within, the human nature, the human person, and then how do we best bring about those to their actualization, rather than trying to impose outcomes. We try to, we try to be better midwives, as Aristotle would say, right? To bring to fruitfulness, to fruition, to birth that which is already within us. So we have two products that we are working on right now. One is it's actually available. It's called Made for Communion. It's a self-paced, free, video-based program that's on our website, and it begins with what I call a communion model, but it begins with looking at the Trinity and how everything can be understood in creation, redemption, and human fulfillment from the perspective of the interior life of the Trinity. How that's manifested in the liturgy and the sacraments, and in the moral life, and really in the Church's social teaching, and how that will be brought to its fulfillment at the end of time. The second is the Great Mystery Marriage Formation Program, which is bringing together all of this knowledge about what it means to be human and what that means about marriage, and then it's a practical implementation of the things that we need to get going. And eventually we would like to take these insights and lessons learned that we have from building these and help other apostolates to be able to look at what they're doing and do what they're doing more fruitfully.
Thank you for listening. To read or listen to the rest of this interview and gain full access to our archive, visit 5booksforcatholics.com and become a premium subscriber. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast and give it a top rating on the platform of your choice. That way more people can discover it. You can also support the podcast and help us produce more interviews like this one by making a one-off donation via the link given in the show notes. As little as $1, £1, or €1 can help and will be greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, and God bless.